Tonight's lecture, Jonathan French. You may recall, some will recall about a year ago, an unpublished PhD thesis by Geoffrey Kerr, which Jonathan has been reading through very carefully, several articles on, and on the York's preservation tradition, who saved the walls. It was the Archbishop. Right, not William Etty played a small part, and it's great when some original research debunks some of the more popular myths. But tonight, Jonathan's going to talk about the preservation of York's parish churches, which a lot of us volunteer at and very relevant to us. He said he'll probably take a few questions at the end, and let's hope the Omni microphone means that those of you on Zoom can actually hear us this time. So when people ask the questions, the microphone will pick up the room. I know because it can hear me from here. So yes, without further ado, Dr. Jonathan French.
All right, thank you very much, John. Thank you. Well, I started this topic from a blank sheet of paper, and I discovered that it was actually a very substantial topic. Yeah, so as I said, I started reading from a blank sheet of paper, and it was the third lecture. I'll come to that in a minute. And it's a very interesting topic because it is not just about the historic building environment, it is also about the history of the Church of England. And I am concentrating on that. It is about, as I said, the Church of England, the medieval churches. And, the church, like now, is dealing with multiple objectives, the needs of a church and its mission, parochial, i.e. the local interests of focusing around each church, antiquarian pressures, and of course money. And in a sense, they had to, there was this Church of England balancing act. I'm not being too facetious about it, but even to this day, the Church of England always has a balancing act to try to deal with all the various groups of opinions, etc. in the church. And that was really like that during the process of considering the future of the medieval churches. So I'm really setting out a framework, and I do focus on the buildings, and really particularly also on the demolitions, the 5 churches which were demolished, because I think that also is an important element of the story. So some element about why some churches survived, or the majority of churches survived, but also really looking at the 5 demolitions. This is my third talk. I've been looking at the history of conservation in York, and that the first one looked particularly at the 19th century, and particularly looked at the saving of York walls. And the second one was into the 20th century, initially private initiatives, particularly by the Morels, but also really about the emergence of planning and planning controls, which then really secured the built environment that we've got to this day. And then, so I decided really to have a go at medieval churches, because one of my sources for all this is a chap that's mentioned by John, is Geoffrey Kerr. And I was doing my own doctorate in York University Library. I'd got this thing out of dusting. I think I was the only person to look at it for 30 years. And I just started reading it, and I was like an illumination, because someone had actually spent their doctorate looking at the history of conservation in York from 1800 to 1983. And it's not been replicated since, and it wasn't there before. And it hadn't been used, it hadn't been cited in any articles or any books. And that, but I've been a bit of an evangelist really to use Geoffrey Kerr's work to bring out the history of conservation, and also then to address some of the myths that have grown up. It was someone else's fault or whatever it is about the buildings, when actually Geoffrey Kerr has given quite a rational story behind that. And he has a very substantial chapters at the end on the churches. So I thought I'd have a go at doing the churches as well. The other people I've looked at is Edward, actually not Boyle, it's Royal. Also, I should move the slide on. Edward Royal, who wrote a Borthwick paper on the Victorian Church, which sets a lot of politics, if you like, if that's the right word, history of the Victorian Church in York. And then finally, a very useful book, if only for the illustrations, really, is Barbara Wilson, Francis Mere, a Archaeological Trust book on the pictorial evidence for York churches. There's other things I've looked at, but if you want to explore that further, this is they're the ones to look forward to. And I also like to thank Sandra of YAYAS and Yorkshire Museum Trust for actually supplying some of the photographs and pictures that I'm using today. So York, of course, is a city of churches. And I've started out with another church altogether, which is Holy Trinity Hull, and that, or Hull Minster now, only by legend that Edward I reputedly said, informing, because Edward I established Hull, Kingston on Hull, and he said that we're only going to have one church, not like York. Now, they've actually got two churches within the medieval area, but I think even then, back in the 13th century, there was an acknowledgement that York had, if you like, too many churches. And in fact, this is the plan of the medieval churches. You won't be able to see it in detail, but it's the plan of the medieval churches from Wilson of Mee's book, and they identify there were 47 medieval churches, and by the late medieval period, there were 40 medieval churches in York. That's not exceptional. There were well, there were over 100 in London. There were 60 in Norwich, 54 in Winchester, 48 in Lincoln. And of those 40, they were gradually degraded by the Reformation, certainly the late 16th century. And then, of course, the Civil War damaged at least 2 churches or destroyed 2 churches. And whilst they were maintained, and there was some rebuilding in the 17th century, particularly about new church towers, it ended up really with 24 in 1800. My start date is 1800. There were 24 churches, and there are 19 today. So this is really a little about starting really about talking about the challenge for the Church of England. And this is from Ted Boyle's book, where he didn't write this down, but I've constructed a table from that. But interestingly enough, 1836, only 55% of the population actually went to church. And I've read that from elsewhere, that those surveys were the assumption that the Victorian age was a great religious age, but actually the very poorest people are often disassociated from the church. It's only roughly about 55% actually went to church. And of that 55%, in 1836, only 38 went to the established church, the COE, the Complete Church of England. And that 56 were dissenters or nonconformists, and 6% were Catholic. By 1851, that had shifted, still only 53% of people going to church, but the Church of England started to pick up the pace. The church, we'll talk about it in a minute, the church, if you like, revived significantly from 1830s, with a loss down for the dissenters, but also a rise in the Catholic population. I think a lot of this may also be the influence of migration, both of Irish migration into city, but also a broader, the whole population of the city changed. So it wouldn't be unusual to have changed the sort of religious population. So what are the challenges? So I just want to very briefly talk about the challenges faced by the Church of England. Ted Boyle described the church in 1830s as moribund. It was a church beset by disorganization, worldliness, unpopularity, and rampant dissent. But at the same time, there was a beginning of an evangelical revival in the Church of England. Also in the mid-18, well, can't be very specific, but the 1830s, there was a revival of, if you like, a more conscientious I can't say religiosity, more conscientious Christianity, and that the church began to be reorganized, the finances were reorganized, and there was an evangelical revival which began to enthuse the clergy, infuse new people to come into the clergy, and revive the activities of the church. And we'll just in a minute later discuss the Oxford movement, but there's also a liturgical revival in the church as well. So how the church services were managed and so on. The other big challenge for the church was depopulation, particularly within the city walls. The population within the city walls, population only grew about 1% in the 19th century, whilst actually the whole population of York grew by about 300%. So, but in reality, that within the city walls, particularly with the in-migration of the Irish community and other poor people, in fact, what was happening, of course, all the congregations within the city walls were in decline. And the church suffered, if you like. All those churches, all 24 of those churches were suffering from, in fact, declining congregations. And that was obviously a real challenge to the church. In addition, the middle classes were moving out from the city, within the city walls, to the suburbs on the outside. So if you like, the wealthier members, the wealthier parishioners were moving away from their traditional medieval churches. So that, you know, there was a diminution of support for the church. Weak finances, well, that was a particular aspect of the church. Anyway, the money was always in the, you know, if you were the archbishop, it actually was quite, you wouldn't think there was weak finances because quite a good return as a salary, but actually down at the bottom, there was both a decline in tax base for the churches. So as the walled city declined, if you like, economically, and in terms of the quality of the buildings, so the rates and the income of the church declined with it. And, you know, it's very difficult for the individual clergy. There were incumbents, but they were often absent. So the person who had the living of a church, as they call it, was often lived elsewhere, and that he would then appoint a curate to then do it for them. And there was a relatively low income. So Holy Trinity in King Square, which we'll talk about, which the church was demolished, the living was only worth £41 per annum, and that the owner of the living employed a curate, paid him £30 an annum to look after it, but that curate had to find another 2 churches to also service in order to get his income up to £100 per annum. So it shows you the lack of resources, and that was, as I said, a challenge for the church. The other thing about the money, there was no money really to build and restore churches within, if you like, church funds, or very little. And in fact, all the building work, largely all the building work in the 19th century was financed by subscriptions. So you went out and you got as many people as you could to contribute money, and you'd obviously on these subscriptions you would publish the list of the subscribers, and that was the way that actually the majority of the money came for restoration of churches, and indeed applied also, you know, going back to the first stages of rebuilding the city walls, also relied on subscriptions. The parochial interest is very important, that people were attached to their church, their local church. And so there was a strong feeling, even though there were declining numbers, there's a lot of attachment to their church. So if their church was threatened, there was quite a number of local people who wanted to rally around and try to rescue it. So all those various processes were going on. And then within these declining congregations, there was actually competition for congregations. And one of the problems for the parish churches of York is the revival of York Minster, particularly under Dean Duncan, who you know, was getting congregations of 2,000 on certain occasions. And of course, what that was doing was sucking the congregations out from the parish churches. So it was quite an intense jockeying, I think, for congregations would be the right term. So moving on then to the physical, the preserving of the historic built environment, if you like, for the churches, as opposed to the challenge for the church. There are 6 things which I sort of emphasize or wish to talk through, which are pertinent to the preserving of the building structures. The first is the Gothic revival, and I'll be talking about these in a minute. Second was the rebuilding and restoration of churches. The third was the revival of the church. Fourth was antiquarian influence. The fifth I'm going to talk about is road widening, and the sixth is suburban expansion. But before I do that, just 2 characters to talk about who are very influential in the process of what should be done with the Victorian period medieval churches. The chaplain on the left is Archdeacon Crek, which is C-R-E-Y-K-E. I think I pronounced that right. He was Archdeacon of York from 1845 to 1866. He'd previously been a very successful headmaster of St Peter's. He took them from 20 pupils to 100 pupils. And then he became Archdeacon, as I said, in 1845. He was responsible for the parish churches within the city. And he was a person who was most insistent that the parish took on the responsibility for preserving their churches. And I think he was quite a fearsome character, and that he was, you know, there were intrepidation really of them, and they really said had to get their hands up, you know, get raising the money for restoration, or get the anger of Archdeacon Crek. The other person is Dean Duncan, as in Duncan Place. He was Dean of the Minster from 1858 to 1880. And he was of an aristocratic background. He was the seventh child, fifth son of the first Baron of Feversham, which is Helm's. And in fact, his unique character, his unique benefit to York was actually he was exceptionally rich. And well, the rumour was that the Minster, which was surviving on about £1,700 a year, one of them really wanted a rich dean, and they got themselves a rich dean to then help them along. His resources are very important in lots of instances of restoring the churches. And his not only his money, but also his influence, of course, as one of the leading clergymen in the city. So I go to the Gothic revival, and because well, let's just talk about this. This is a new church designed by Pugin, who was responsible for the interior of the House of Lords. He designed the what we now know as Elizabeth Tower that looked out, that has Big Ben inside it. So he was a major advocate of the Gothic, and that it is useful just to look at this church, which is in Cheadle, built by 1846, and it was done in this Gothic revival style. So there's certain things to note. One of those is, though it's brand new, exposed beams in the roof, no galleries. Lots of churches have galleries. You know, although it's highly decorated, essentially a relatively simple structure, and of course the pews are all standardized and facing the altar. And this is, I put this up because it shows really what Gothic revival was expecting of how churches should look in the Victorian period. Essentially, a sort of idealized medieval church. And Pugin published a book in 1841 called The True Principles of Pointed or Christian Architecture. And one of the people who commented on that said he thought that it was one of the most influential books on architecture of any time. And that Pugin, who was a romantic Catholic convert, did look back to the medieval period as a stimulus, if like, of the sort of, what, no more than a stimulus, that gave him the enthusiasm for this style of architecture. And, you know, Gothic generally was coming forward just around this 1830s, 1840s period, as the Victorian people, or the early Victorian people, later Georgia, started to look back to the medieval period as some golden age. You know, we have Walter Scott with Ivanhoe and the Waverley novels and things like that. This romanticism of that somehow the medieval period was a more ordered and less chaotic world than the world they found themselves in. But the Victorians, as usual, were max contradictions. They looked back to the medieval past, but they also celebrated industry, commerce, and entrepreneurship. So they sort of balanced each other. So their art tended to look back to the medieval, but that didn't deny them actually denying, you know, they wanted also to pursue progress. And within that context, for the Anglican Church, of course, we then have the Oxford movement around the same time that was adopting Catholic ritual. They were looking back to the medieval period and starting to think about you know, revitalizing the church, getting away from, if you like, that the greyness of the post-Reformation church, and looking back to the medieval period. So they introduced vestments for clergy, incense, even confessions, and they started, certain of the priests, Anglican priests might start being called father. You know, so there's some looking back, but they were still within the Church of England. It was Anglo-Catholic or High Church, as we call it, and that they were very influential in terms of the built environment. One of the organisations called the Cambridge Camden Society, founded in the late 1830s, which then all became the Ecclesiological Society, and they wrote a book, A Few Words for Church Builders, in 1841. It sounds modest, but that was actually a hugely influential book, and became, if I might term the Bible, that's the wrong term really, but it became the model for both new church building and for the restoration of churches. And it was, as described, it's theologically based architecture. So it's a celebration of the Gothic and that's really how they thought churches should be both built, and then if you're going to restore an existing church, how you should then restore the church to fit into that model. And that was instantaneous, that influence, and it was just extraordinary, really, how the Gothic became established as the, well, even right into the 20th century as the normal, if you like, church architecture. And I just want to show what they're talking about, because this is Whitby, one of my favourite churches of St Mary's up on the hillside there, or East Fifth, and that because it's a survivor. It survived the Gothic revival. And so what you have in here, you have galleries, you have box pews, and you have ceilings. And all of those things were the things which actually the restorers and the Gothic revival, the restorers wanted to get rid of. They wanted to get rid of the galleries in part because it stopped the ideal presentation of this medieval structure. It got in the way of this medieval structure. They wanted to get rid of ceilings when they could. I don't think very much in Whitby, because I think that's the actual roofs are flatter. But where the roof was an apex, they wanted to remove the ceiling so you could expose the beams, like they perceived what a medieval church would have looked like. So going back to Pugin's church, even though he built it new, he built a roof with exposed beams, because they were going back what they thought would be an ideal medieval church. So let's go and look at some individual churches and looking about rebuilding. And I've taken St Sampson's as an example of the rebuilding process of churches. Churches, you got to understand, in the 1830s, they were in very poor physical condition, structurally often unsound, even dangerous. They were damp. They had graveyards that were unhealthy. Often the graveyards were 3 or 4 foot above the floor of the church. So as you came out, you were surrounded by the rising bodies. I don't know how, I don't really look into graveyards. I thought that's too much. But obviously, and there was a very unhealthy, so there was no sanitation. They were cold and dark. And so we were looking really that what do we do if you want to restore the church, and what process we go through. And actually, the degree of rebuilding was very significant. In 1844, the decision was made to need to rebuild the walls, aisle, and tower of St Sampson's, which was threatened with demolition. And within 2 years, they'd raised £2,000 from various sources, including their rates, subscriptions, and actually from a national society, which is quite important, called the Society for Enlarging and Rebuilding Churches and Chapels. And that later became the Incorporated Church Building Society. And they actually had national resources, which I think they're probably given to them by aristocratic benefactors that gave grants to support the restoration and building of new churches. And this really demonstrates how dramatic rebuilding was, because that is the church in 1843, and that is the starting point for restoration. So there's hardly anything left when they, because both the structure was unsound, but the way to solve that was virtually to demolish the church, keep it these bits, and then rebuild it in that similar form. And this carried on into the 19th century, 20th century, early 20th century, when St Sampson's, the tower, which was also in poor condition, was then fully restored about 1910. Interesting, you see, what you've got, in a sense, in St Sampson's is a brand new church, which is almost an exact copy of what was there before. I don't know about the interior, because the interior would have fitted in with what the Gothic, the new standards from Gothic revival. But essentially, it's a Victorian church that looks like a medieval church, but it's, it is a church. It's my grandfather's hammer was, that sort of thing. You change the handle one year and you change the head another year. It's still my grandfather's hammer. So many churches went through very substantial rebuilding, and they are 150 years old now, written old, 180 years old, but they're very valued. but it's really not right to call them medieval. Their churches reconstructed in the medieval style. Now just go to a lovely new word which I discovered in these researches, was repewing. And that what we have here is the interior of All Saints in Pavement. And it actually, of course, an example of from St Helens of Gudrungate of box pews which survived. The survival of box pews here is extremely rare, and we see them in Whitby, and we've got them in St Helens, but virtually everywhere else that would have had box pews would have had them removed and substituted with the standard seating pattern, facing the altar, facing the pulpit. And the reason for that was that box pews, in a sense, reflected with privileged people. You rented your pew. There were stories of the squire in the middle of the sermon. The butler would come through and do his box pew and give him his lunch, and then go away. The butler would go away again. It was a different sort of church from what we imagine today. And it was also, of course, for the poor who couldn't sit in these pews because they didn't pay the rent for them. They either sat on stools or they sat on benches or they stood in the church. So access for the poor was very restricted. And for this new revived Church of England, they wanted to make it open to all. And so repewing was, I remember that organization was called about enlarging churches, enlarging. So they were enlarging the capacity of a church to take more people. And in fact, the Church Building Society, which gave grants to churches who were being restored or revived, that they had extraordinarily explicit instructions as to what the pews should look like, right down to the design of the wooden frameworks and so on. So if you wanted a grant from us, you've got to do your pew arrangement as we say, sir. That's, you think about it, every church looks like this. And why does it look like that? Because if they wanted the money to do it, and also the fact that there was a theological, if you like, demand for churches to have open access to a much wider community, and then all through the period of the Victorian period, this repewing process took place. And I just used All Saints. I mean, All Saints actually had galleries as well, which they also removed in part of that, their restoration process in All Saints. The next couple of churches to talk about is the influence of the Catholic challenge. And these are particularly St Margaret's in Warmgate and St Denis at the top end of Warmgate. St Margaret's was right in the middle of the slum area, right in the middle of the Irish population. And its parish rate was abandoned in the 1840s because it was so poor, the area. It wasn't collecting any money whatsoever. There was a non-resident incumbent, so there wasn't the person who was responsible for the church wasn't living there. And he described it as the Whitechapel of York. But the Anglican desire to counter this Catholic revival was very important to the Anglican Church of England, the Anglican Church. And that so initially the incumbent and some of the local clergy and this Church Building Society did do some early rehabilitation of the church of St Margaret's. But it was actually the key rebuilding or restoration of St Margaret's took place in the 1850s. And it gives you an example of like desire of the Victorian people to counter, they see the Catholic Church challenge, because all the money came from aristocrats in Yorkshire. So the Fevershams, that was Dean Duncan's family at Helmsley, Viscount Down in Wycombe, Carlisle, I think is Castle Howard, the Archbishop himself, the Dean, and 20 clergy, plus these national funds, gathered all the money together to do St Margaret's in Warmgate, because there would be no money locally, because essentially there was a Catholic parish. They wanted to make sure, however, the Church of England stood its ground and they actually had a church working there. And similarly, I think the same thing about St Denis, which also had the same challenges and therefore was able to get money and resources from way beyond its boundaries, because the Church of England and its supporters wanted to say, well, we've got to, as to say, stand our ground against the Catholic challenge, because the congregation would essentially be Catholic. So just move forward to the antiquarian side. Now, when I'm splitting these things, it doesn't mean that it's exclusive. It just means it's somebody trying to illustrate some of the influences on the restoration of churches. And of course, then that brings us to wonderful time, 1842, the foundation of the Yorkshire Architectural Society, to which was added the York Archaeological and Yorkshire Architectural Society, so YAYAS, was founded in 1842. But it was a society that was exclusively confined to Anglican clergymen. And I think there was once a debate on the constitution of YAYAS in the 1960s, and someone pointed out actually in the constitution it still said only YAYAS members had to all be Anglican clergy. But anyway, it was run by Anglican clergymen specifically to raise money to support modern improvements and restorations in church. It had influence, but it didn't have much money, and that it really didn't develop the sources that made a difference. But it's an important part of this us sitting here, I think. And individuals, you know, particularly the Rain family, who were very involved in YAYAS and then in YAYAS later on, are very important components of that from the clergy. So in terms of Holy Trinity at Gudrungate, it was already in 1819 viewed as an antiquarian building. The incumbent was a keen preserver. There was some rebuilding work and further rebuilding work in 1832 when the saddleback roof was retained. The local ratepayers weren't very keen on spending money on their church, which had the double benefit. You know Low Row cottages in Gudrungate, the oldest houses in York? Well, the ratepayers of the Gudrungate parish were so mean that they didn't want to pay to demolish the cottages to improve the vista of St Helen's Church, which means we have actually, one of the reasons why we have saved some of the oldest structures in the city. And the major effort was in 1857 when the incumbent, James Rain, who was the canon Rain, but is also involved with YAS, Joshua Terry, the Yorkshire Philosophical Society, the Archbishop, supported a restoration as an antiquarian church. And it was not about enlarging the church or anything like that, which is why it kept its box pews, because they said, well, we're not going to, it hardly got any congregation. We don't want to expand the congregation. It's a church without a congregation. So actually, that was the rationale, not spending money on getting rid of the box pews. And that in reality, St Helens has been a church without a congregation for 150 years. And it's been preserved as an antiquarian church, and we'll come back to that later as to its preservation today. And All Saints is also equally valued. All Saints in North Street. I think Pugin, is it pronounced Pugin? I call it Pugin anyway. Pugin, there we are. Pugin, I only read about it, I don't listen to what people say. So Pugin reputedly visited York in 1840. There's a little article in the 2010 York Historian by Bill Fawcett, this recording Pugin's visit to York, and he probably visited All Saints and was appalled by the dilapidation and mess inside All Saints in 1840, and particularly about the stained glass. And it was very rapidly, Yorkshire Architectural Society and others moved quickly to preserve the stained glass in All Saints, and that but again, it's remained very dilapidated, and there's subscriptions supported by Dean Duncan in 1865 to actually restore the church, and he restored it very much as a high church, a Gothic revival church, Anglo-Catholic church, but at the insistence of the Archbishop, he made all the pews free, and so when they repewed it, in a way, it was a low church repewing, but a high church decoration. But again, that's an example of Dean Duncan putting his hand in the pocket, really, to fundamentally pay for the restoration of All Saints. And this finally, examples of road widening. All Saints in Pavement was really rather a victim of road widening. Going back into the 18th century, this ground in front of it was once the church, and it was truncated in order to provide the provisions market in the city. Then when you may know that Parliament Street was cut through the city in 1830s, and then that exposed the lack of access to Parliament Street. So again, All Saints had lost both its land and they had to rebuild the church next to Ousgate because it was relying on buttresses, which was stopping the pedestrian access into Ousgate. So they pulled the wall down so they could build it without buttresses. So there was improved access into Ousgate. So in fact, it was only up to 1890s when James Rain almost said no more truncations of All Saints for road widening purposes. The other church, which particularly is an example of the impact of road widening, is St John's in Micklegate, going right back. It was a church in a very strategic location in terms of traffic, and that it was in 1809 the street widening started, and they got compensation because their burial ground was taken for the street. Churches, in a sense, didn't mind being used for rewidening because they got money for the rewinding, and then also, say, the improvement commissioners who were responsible in the early part of the 19th century for things would also finance building the boundaries, new railings around the church. And they might also finance rebuilding aspects of the church. And in particular, it was very dilapidated in 1849, but the Archdeacon insisted on its restoration, and it's very significant restoration because basically this wall here was set back a few feet to facilitate access to North Street, and this wall, the south wall, was dilapidated. So effectively, this wall and that wall were completely rebuilt in the 1850s period, and that just move forward to another example of road widening. This is St Mary's Bishop Hill. Popular church, Dean Duncan himself, again, paid very substantially for its restoration. But with the opening of Parish Street, the access to Fetter Lane here was very restricted. But the church was more than happy to hand over part of its burial ground and part of its land to improve access into the area because they were local people. It was not the church wardens and others were local people. And for them, lack of access or very poor access into the area was an issue for them. So they were quite happy for portions of the church to be taken for road widening. It didn't cost them things because they would be compensated for it, but also the city council later or the improvement commissioners would pay for the restoration of the damage done by road widening. So it was an easy and productive relationship, if you like, both between the church and if you like, let's call them the council here. And St Saviour's as well, you know, it lost land to the widening of Hungate, which is called a street which we've rather lost now because of Peelbury and all that area. But this was a major part of Hungate, and St Saviour's actually significantly lost land for this for widening Hungate. But again, the improvement commissioners paid for all the new railings and paid money in compensation. So they were, again, quite happy. But also, as locals, they were pleased because it was improving accessibility into their area. And finally, on this sort of looking at the factors affecting rebuilding or restoration or what have you, this is the question of suburban expansion. And we now reach the stage of actually thinking about demolitions of churches. As we said, the population of York expanded very quickly. That meant outside the walls, very substantial amount of suburban development. You know, we call it inner suburbs, but all that area around Nunnery Lane, Monkgate, Holgate, Hull Road was all built up in the 19th century. And that, you know, what do we do about churches for these people? And St Maurice's, which is in Monkgate, was you know, a significant parish church, but its parish was expanding exponentially, and the parishioners and leading members of the parish wanted to say, well, let's, we've got all these people now, we want to get into the church. We've got to completely rebuild a church so we have the capacity for this massive expanding population. And that it was agreed that St Maurice could be pulled down and replaced. This was a church, they replaced it, which was actually demolished itself in the 1960s. But St Maurice's was demolished. There was some antiquarian opposition, but people like Dean Duncan and others denigrated the antiquarian quality of St Maurice's, and that supported the parishioners in terms of getting a new church. And I think that demonstrates that when it comes down to fulfilling the mission of the church, if the church was not able to do that, like St Maurice's, then the church was willing to support and deal with, oppose, say no to the antiquarians, that we will demolish the church and build a new one. And that also was replicated with St Lawrence's in Hull Road, when later on the church was demolished, just the tower remains and the Norman doorway was put in the new church, but again, an acceptance that if the church was totally inadequate for the parochial needs of that area, then they went to build new churches. And also we had new churches in Holgate, St Clement's, which we'll come to, were built at that same time because their need behind building new churches because of the expanding population. In order, to keep really the mission, the church's mission was the most important thing to them, and not preservation, if you like, of building structures. So we now come to the Archbishop's Commission of 1884. And a little bit of word now about the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings. I don't know how familiar people are with the Society for Protection of Ancient Buildings, but it was founded by William Morris. We're all happy. We know who William Morris is. We're all right on William Morris. Anyway, so it was founded by William Morris and his colleagues in 1877. Particularly was actually to help defend the original medieval churches, and that the Archbishop's Commission in 1884 was threatening, or apparently threatening the churches. And I took this picture actually of the William Morris Museum many years ago at Walthamstow, and it's finally come to a use here. But it was a poster that the Society had for its public meeting in York. In May 1884, and it's called the Proposed Demolition of York Churches in a public meeting. They did have a long discussion of whether William Morris would be too radical for the citizens of York and whether he should be allowed to speak. But they decided then they would bring William Morris with them, and maybe it would be all right. The Archbishop's Commission sought to begin to deal radically with this whole problem of declining churches, and its basic proposal was to amalgamate parishes. So you've got two parish churches, they're both failing. Let's amalgamate the parish. And what that means, of course, one church becomes dominant and the other church is ceased to be dominant. And they use the word, it will be disused. They didn't say we're going to be demolishing. There was no, and in fact, when the public meeting was held, William Hargrove, who was editor of the York Herald, stood up and actually said, this is not about demolition. The Society of Protection has got it totally wrong. We are not about demolishing churches. This is about, disuse of churches. And that, so the recommendations were that St Crux would be merged with All Saints, Pavement, Holy Trinity, King Square with St Sampson's, St Michael Spurrier Gate with St Margaret Castlegate, St Helena Stonegate with St Martin Coney Street, St John Micklegate with All Saints North Street, and St Martin cum Gregory with Holy Trinity Micklegate. And this idea of one of the churches becoming less important, becoming disused, did make those churches vulnerable. Particularly, this was one of the reasons heading towards the demolition of St Crux and the ultimate demolition in the 1930s of Holy Trinity in King Square. So let's go to St Crux. This is the this is St Crux looked like in the 19th century, early 19th century. This was the restoration scheme. St Crux. And so there's modifications to the tower, but basically to produce that sort of rather restored, again, that restored medieval church. But this is in 1884, and that these sorts of schemes were beginning to lose favour, and that we can come to these rather, I don't know if you're familiar with these rather famous pictures described as St Crux being demolished. We'll come to that in a minute. There was little restoration of this undervalued church. Interventions were confined to limited demolitions and short-term structural repairs. It was closed in 1882 on architectural advice because it basically was falling down and it was a hazard. They had a restoration committee in the 1870s, but the key members had fled to the suburbs and there was no resources, if you like, within the parish to do anything. The Society for Protection of Aged tried to find national local funding in 1882, but failed. And there was a subscription to restore the church of about £2,000. And what they decided to do was to start the restoration process. So actually what you are seeing there is in effect the church in restoration. It's that they demolished the bits that were substandard or falling down, and then they had no money because they discovered actually the problems were much worse. So it froze like that for 3 years. And that even though there were attempts to get a subscription going, the fact the Archbishop's Commission had said it was a closed church, a disused church, put people off. People weren't subscribing. The Dean, Puri Crust, was against the whole process in principle, so he didn't support the subscription. So nothing was happening. The subscription failed. James Raine and the Archbishop tried again in 1886 to get a subscription going to complete the restoration. But again, that subscription failed. So inevitably, the church had to agree that it would be demolished. And then, if you know, there's a new schoolroom. They put in a schoolroom just down at the bottom of Whitmer Wappington. Just to bring out the fact that this is a church awaiting restoration, I just bring it to attention. Look at the wooden formats there holding up the arch. And again, you can see, so you can see that this is a church that has been partly demolished, but it hasn't been demolished. They're actually saving the church at this point for that restoration program. And that these pictures, I think, reflect that rather than actually the end demolition. It's only my personal view, but I just feel somehow that, for 3 years, that's what the St Crux looked like as they tried to raise the money to restore it. But ultimately, it ended to its demolition, and that, that it was a result of 2 centuries of indifferent maintenance, population loss, and increasingly fastidious antiquarian attitudes to complete it. Basically, restoration has been going on in the 60s and 70s, 1860s and 70s, became deeply unfashionable. Maybe that's the influence of Society for Protection of Ancient Buildings. It was not valued anymore. It was felt that the restoration had destroyed the character of many of the medieval structures. And Geoffrey Kerr said, basically, St Crux fell between 2 eras. It was too late for the restoration of a working church and too early for an antiquarian overhaul. I do all this because actually the myth is this was just an act of some civic vandalism, pulling down St Crux, it should never have happened. And I'd go through this little bit because, like all things, there's an explanation. I don't agree with the explanation, but the explanation was there to say why had that church been demolished. So I'll just move forward to the interwar period. Do we all know J.B. Morrell? No, everybody knows what J.B. Morrell is? Good. So J.B. Morrell, was a great advocate of preservation in the city, and he was a very advocate of the idea of a city of churches. So he wanted to preserve the churches as part of, if you like, the urban landscape. And that was an important concept, both in the Victorian, but a bigger concept in the interwar period. The church, right at the beginning, I was telling you the church had got what they call ecclesiastical exemption from planning controls, ancient monuments. So the church was never covered by these acts which protected other historic buildings. And that carried on. But the church had to concede in the 1920s to some participation around it. And they formed diocesan advisory committees of architects, clergy, lay people, including Dr. Evelyn in York of YAYAS, to advise on preserving the medieval structures. And actually, if they want to make alterations, the Isleston Advisory Committee was able to speak up to protect churches. And that there was, of course, declining resources. There wasn't the money around. There wasn't the money for subscriptions anymore. People were poorer. The middle classes and the upper classes had lost interest, and there wasn't the same amount of money in the system. So there was less money for street widening, so there wasn't compensation. You couldn't get money from street widening, which helped to restore the churches. So in many ways, the churches were in a more parlous state financially than they had been, going back into the 19th century. In addition, slum clearance in the city, within the city walls, was adding to declining congregations. So Hungate went, pieces of Warngate went. So that in itself also meant congregation went to decline. So the process of the decline of the city churches within the city walls was a continuing process into the interwar period. And the Archbishop's Commission, another Archbishop Commission, Archbishop Temple in 1930, was really to examine, again, rather like the 1884 Commission, how do we deal with this? How do we deal with this as a church? And that he initiated his Archbishop Temple's sort of perspective was, I am trying to build a new church in Town Hall, and I can't get the money to this working class council estate. And yet all the money is in looking after these medieval churches in the city centre who haven't got any congregation. Now, that was their perspective. And so, he was trying to say, how do we rebalance the resources of the Church of England so we can actually carry on with our mission as a church? And that, so the commission in 1931 concluded that the parochial needs outweigh preserving structures. So it's quite a radical thing to say, isn't it? Actually, it's more important to the church that we can meet our parochial requirements to fulfill our mission than it is to preserve the buildings. And that they proposed selling St John Micklegate, St Mary's Bishop Hill Senior, St Saviour's, St Michael Spurrier Gate, and St Helens or Holy Trinity King Square, just to sell the sites. And that, demolish the churches and sell the site, or sell the sites, and then someone will demolish the churches. This didn't go around well, particularly with YAYAS, and that both Dr. Evelyn and also James Rain's son, the Reverend Angelo Rain, actually wrote a pamphlet on 5 churches in peril, and that tremendous advocacy against these proposals. And so, so where, if you like, I went back to the beginning, how people valued their local churches and the incumbents and clergy, that those ones who valued their churches and the incumbents who valued those churches would stand up and try then to save their churches. The ones that didn't have that advocacy were the ones that went by the wayside. And that really the Archbishop's Commission of 1931 was largely unsuccessful. And Archbishop Temple said, trouble with preservationists is that they do not offer solutions. But the 2 churches, then, an example of the ones that, if you like, survived the Archbishop's Commission was St John's. St John's was in a pretty bad state, and indeed the church was preparing it for demolition. In the late 30s, they'd taken away the glass, the fittings, and they actually gave the church to the council. They sort of washed their hands of it and just gave it to the council. And it was really through the offices of J.B. Morrell as a councillor, who slowed down the process and saying, well, don't demolish it now, let's just think about it. And actually then the World War II came in, and again, that stopped things. And in fact, it was saved by, J.B. Morrell became chair of the York Civic, well, he was the first chair of the York Civic Trust, and the Civic Trust was trying to get a university into the city, and that one of the things they wanted to do was to build the academic credential of the city. And one way of doing it was to establish the Institute of Advanced Architectural Studies in 1956. And he said, well, J.B. Morrell said, St John's, use St John's. And with also support from the other J.B. Morrell slush fund called the Joseph Ramsey Social Services Trust, it gave £12,000 to restore St John as the base for this new institute. And I think, I caught that, and I've checked this out, I'm pretty sure that's the first secular use of a medieval church. So it saved the church by finding a new secular use, and that survived until later on. Of course, the Institute of moved to King's Manor when the university was set, and then it became an art centre and now a club. But so it survived because of those sort of processes going on. Similarly, St Michael's Spurriergate, the incumbent, he wasn't incumbent, but he was the rector of Heworth, was also responsible for St Michael's Spurriergate, and he said we were not having that, we're not being demolished. He then devoted that St Michael's became a lunchtime venue for discussions, lectures, cinema, a social centre, and essentially that has survived as a religious institution with the Spurriergate Centre, which is still a part of the church. And so even though that church was threatened by the Archbishop's Commission, essentially the local rector and other supporters ensure that it survived, and it survives to this day as a religious building. So, sorry, that's all right, carrying on another few minutes. The big one then is Holy Trinity, King's Square. Holy Trinity was threatened really from late 18th century. In the 8th century, the parish demolished the north aisle. Here, this is a plan from Geoffrey Kerr's thesis. The Chantry Chapel here was demolished to provide extra space for the Haymarket. And then there was tremendous advocacy of doing something about the turn of the coaches into St Andrew Gate from Collier Gate. And there were fatalities. And so something had to be done. And so the idea was actually to pull down Holy Trinity, but there's a sensible no, let's go too far. But these red lines represent the truncation of Holy Trinity. So more was cut off and then rebuilt. So this was the idea of restoring Holy Trinity. But this is what it looked like prior to this restoration. And you can see here the evidence of the chancel, which had been demolished for the Haymarket. So in 1858, only 12 people were going to church in Holy Trinity. There's another proposal to demolish, but the Archbishop and the Dean felt that was wrong to do that, and they lifted the burden of church maintenance from the locals, and in fact got a subscription going to restore the church, and so that was then the restored church they were aiming for in that restoration. They were trying to keep the church going, though effectively it wasn't undertaking any parochial purpose. So the church then was like that in the interwar period. In 1910, the parish initiated another demolition plan because it had merged with St Sampson's. And St Sampson's was a successful church, a good, strong congregation, but it needed to keep restoration. So St Sampson's says, well, let's take stuff away from Holy Trinity and use that to restore St Sampson's. And back in the 20s, St Sampson's actually tried to sell Holy Trinity's bells. And the Diocesan Advisory Committee, including Dr. Egan, stopped them doing that. But you could see that basically this disused church was just being slowly run down, and been slowly run down effectively from the mid-Victorian period. And in 1936, we had the Archbishop's Commission. The church really wanted rid of it. They wanted the church demolished. It was derelict, vandalized. The incumbent said there was nothing beautiful about the church. It was impossible to ensure. And YAYAS were concerned that, YAYAS were concerned about demolition and fought against it. But ultimately, in 1938, J.B. Morrell, once he got the agreement of the City Council that they wouldn't redevelop the King's Square, and they'd leave the King's Square as it was, and so on, and look after the shambles. Once he got that, he said, well, I stopped, and so the Holy Trinity went then and was demolished. But really, it was a church that was not valued, and what have you. I'm going to jump because I'm taking George's time, but I'm going to talk about St Mary's Senior. I'll just very briefly on that. St Mary's Senior is a bit different. The incumbent of St Mary's Senior in 1870s decided he was going to build St Clement's. there was no merger going on. He said, I'm going to build St Clement's. So they built St Clement's. He got the money to build St Clement's. And what happened then? All the money that was for Bishop to look after St Mary Bishop Hill Senior went to St Clement's, and no maintenance was undertaken for Bishop Hill Senior until, and it just went down and down and downhill into the 1960s. It was demolished, and actually parts of it were taken. The Church of the Holy Redeemer, but as, I want to finish off, please, I'll just jump that one if you don't mind. Post-war preservation. Well, the ecclesiastical exemption continued, but actually churches were listed. Some of the better medieval churches were actually listed under planning control in 1954. So beginning to get a bit of influence from the government and the local authority into the maintenance of churches. There was something called the Bridge Commission nationally, that one of its key recommendations was to form the Redundant Churches Commission. And that was established in 1968 with half of the money coming from the government. And they would started taking responsibility for some of these listed churches. And that became the Churches Conservation Trust, which now looks after Holy Trinity in Goodrem Gate and the tower at St Lawrence's. So that's how those particular ones have survived and into that organisation. The difficulty was finding alternative uses, and this really then fell to the Civic Trust, and the Civic Trust really took on with great enthusiasm, particularly I think from John Shannon, when John Shannon became chairman, that about devoting their resources to preserving the churches that were still heading towards redundancy. And that in 1957, they established a medieval church fund, which did some assistance to churches. The Archbishop formed a York Redundant Churches Commission, thought it was £100,000 were required to renovate York churches. And in 1969, the Archbishop formed the Diocesan Redundant Churches Committee, which was chaired by John Shannon of the Civic Trust. And they really did address the problem. And the Civic Trust was really a most influential and successful body in dealing with post-war redundant churches. And I put it there because Geoffrey Kerr calls it the triumph of the Civic Trust. And I think it's quite fair to say that in a very brief period from late 60s to the mid 70s, the Civic Trust, and I think John Shannon almost personally as well, really pulled the stops out to save the churches. All Saints, for instance, Civic Trust took over responsibility for preservation and raised £30,000. Civic Trust is very good at raising money from other people for supporting these projects. Obviously, they were involved in converting St John's to an art centre, as we've already discussed. St Mary's Castlegate is a very good case example. It was unused since 1959. Civic Trust had helped with the repairs, but the Civic Trust advocated its use as an exhibition space. And the Civic Trust always hears about money. And one of the things the Arts Council felt it had to do something for European Architectural Heritage Year in 1975. And so it put a budget of £55,000 nationally to do that. And the advocacy of the Civic Trust made sure that 40,000 of that went to St Mary's Castlegate, along with £5,000 to the Civic Trust and £55,000 from the council. And the council took ownership of St Mary's Castlegate, established as an exhibition, and today it's still part of the Yorkshire Museum Trust portfolio. The exhibitions have never been perhaps as successful as one might have hoped. St Sampson's, again, the idea was to make it an old people centre, but the trust found money from something called the Hayward Foundation, who put in £67,000 to convert St Sampson's Centre into an older person centre, and the Round Table put in the £6,000 to fit it out. So that, again, that new secular uses are being found. And then finally, St Saviour's and St Margaret's Walmgate initially were taken over by the trust for the purpose of storage, and but the storage, of course, was ultimately St Saviour's became the Ark, and then the Dig for the York Archaeological Trust, and in St Margaret's Warmgate initially was storage for the Theatre Royal, but very soon became, or not very soon, but then became a centre for early music. So you can see the influence of the trust enabling then these historic redundant churches to become into a secular use, which then enables the long-term preservation of the building. So just some conclusions. If anybody wants to read Geoffrey Kerr's doctorate, which is pretty inaccessible because it's only actually in a volume. I did have it scanned at the British Library, but the British Library has been what do you call it? Subject to what's the point when what's the word for when you attack a what hacked? Yes. Anyway, so I don't think the British Library is currently working, but I can actually I got it scanned, so people can look at it. And I've also done a guide for it. So if you want to read the 141 pages Geoffrey Kerr talks about churches in York, I'll happily give you my guide to do that, and that's my email there. So if you want to email me, I will do that. I just think then the final point is, how important local desire was in keeping the churches that did survive, and the importance of local congregations achieving that. And the demolitions reflected lack of local support and the needs of the suburbs. So the churches need to fulfill its mission in the suburbs means that those other churches with relative issues ended up going. And I've always, in these lectures, tried to explain the historic context for conservation and hopefully, get rid of some of the myths that might have built up. And as I said, if you want any more information of my sources, particularly Geoffrey Kerr, then that's my email, and just drop me a line now. I'll happily give you. Sorry, I went slightly over, but